Britain had heard royal announcements before: abdications, marriages, deaths, new titles. But nothing prepared the palace for the decree King Charles placed on the table that morning. His hand remained beside the document as the room fell completely silent. Prince William was not merely being prepared for the throne. Charles had ordered that his son's coronation be formally arranged to take place while the king himself was still alive. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles entered the restricted meeting carrying a sealed red folder, refusing to hand it over. William watched his father take the central chair while Queen Camilla and Princess Anne remained silent beside the advisors. The decree, a formal command carrying the monarch's authority, was opened after the doors closed. Its meaning was clear. Preparations for William's coronation, the ceremony in which a sovereign is formally crowned before the nation, would begin at once. The ceremony would happen during the king's lifetime, with Charles personally overseeing the transfer of ceremonial authority. William read the central paragraph once, then again. His fingers tightened before he lowered it. "You want to watch me be crowned?" the prince asked. Charles did not answer. The silence wounded more than denial, because the future king felt the distance between being trained for destiny and being pushed toward it by his father. Across the table, Camilla's shock hardened into tension. The decree also froze independent changes to the coronation programme, meaning no household could reshape William's future ceremony without approval. The queen consort understood what that removed from her reach, and the realisation settled heavily between them. Anne leaned closer to the final page. Beneath the king's signature, she found a handwritten sentence. The crown must enter its next chapter without uncertainty, delay, or divided command. The Princess Royal read it twice and looked directly at Charles. She understood before William did. This was not about timing. It was about preventing competing loyalties from tearing apart the next reign. When grief had already made the family vulnerable, Charles turned toward his son. The king told him this was not an abdication written in fear. Abdication meant a sovereign voluntarily giving up the throne, and he had not done that. He was building a controlled transition because he refused to leave William with a palace war after his death. The prince looked at Camilla, then back at his father. Something inside the family had forced this decree into existence. And when William finally asked his father what had forced him to act now, Charles gave only 4 words. "Ask me about Windsor." The decree was only 1 page long, but for the 3 people closest to the throne, it carried 3 completely different meanings. To Charles, it was protection. To William, it felt dangerously close to a farewell. And to Camilla, sitting only a few chairs away, it sounded like the unmistakable closing of a door she had spent decades struggling to enter. Suddenly, the crown was no longer an institution. It was personal. William left the meeting with the words pressing against him. He had spent years preparing to become monarch, but preparation had always belonged to a distant future, not to a ceremony his father might stand beside and witness. The coronation, the formal ceremony in which a sovereign is crowned before the nation, now felt less like triumph and more like an emotional dividing line. Charles feared something worse. The king knew unresolved family tensions could follow his son into the next reign, and grief could turn rivalry into a struggle for control. William caught Princess Anne in a corridor and stopped her before she could leave. The prince admitted that accepting the decree felt like agreeing that his father's chapter was already closing. Anne studied him. The Princess Royal, the title held by the monarch's senior daughter, told him Charles might see the decision differently. Perhaps, she said, this was the first time the king could give his son what he himself had never received. A transition shaped before loss, not after it. Camilla sat alone after the meeting and removed her glasses without reading the briefing in front of her. When Charles entered, the Queen Consort looked at him and asked whether he had already decided what place she would have after William was crowned. He paused. Then the monarch said he would not discuss her future until his son knew the full story of Windsor. She understood the wound. The prince was about to hear something the king had kept even from his wife, and her silence carried more pain than anger. Anne later spoke to William through a documented account of the decree's drafting, explaining that Charles had worked on it over 3 nights. Yet the princess stopped when she reached the final paragraph. The king had changed those words after a private ceremony at Windsor Castle, she said, but she refused to explain further. William remembered the night his father had cancelled dinner, dismissed the household staff, and ordered the coronation succession files, the records governing a transfer of royal authority, before midnight. The palace had called that Windsor evening routine, but Charles had walked away from it, convinced that waiting any longer could fracture the next reign before it even began. Every royal crisis has a moment that looks insignificant, until history turns back and stares at it. For Charles, that moment came during a private Windsor ceremony only 11 days before the decree. There were no crowds and no grand announcements, just a rehearsal, an old ceremonial oath, and one unexpected disagreement over who would control the transition after the king's reign. By midnight, Charles had stopped treating the future as a distant concern. Charles entered the Windsor continuity rehearsal expecting procedure, not conflict. The rehearsal was a closed exercise designed to test what would happen during the first 48 hours after a future succession, meaning the immediate transfer of the crown from one monarch to the next. Advisors began explaining how William's coronation plans could still be revised after the king's death. Then, separate household teams presented competing chains of authority. The prince's office wanted direct control. Camilla's household expected consultation. Senior palace administrators argued that continuity required temporary, shared influence. Charles listened, and the king slowly understood why the argument mattered. His son could inherit grief and a power struggle on the same day. William challenged the process when he realised decisions about his own ceremony might be made while he was mourning. The prince looked directly at his father and said he would not argue over power beside Charles's coffin. The words hit the king with brutal force. Camilla objected when the future king suggested that all discretionary influence, meaning the freedom to shape non-mandatory royal decisions, should pass immediately to his office upon accession. Her voice remained controlled. William leaned back and stopped responding. Charles watched his son emotionally retreat, and the monarch recognised the danger of silence replacing trust. A senior advisor changed everything by placing 3 conflicting coronation schedules on the table. Charles pulled them closer and compared the handwritten amendments, each assigning influence to different households. The king read one page, then another. His expression hardened. Suddenly, he ordered everyone except William to leave. Camilla paused before walking out, but the monarch did not stop her. The door closed, and father and son were finally alone. Charles set the schedules down. They are already planning the argument, the king told him in that private recorded account, later preserved in the decree file. William stared at the papers. Then don't leave me to have it. The prince's answer became the direct trigger. That same night, Charles began drafting the lifetime coronation decree, but William knew nothing about the second meeting. Charles later summoned Camilla alone, listened to her defend one disputed proposal, and finally removed a single page from her hands. By the time William learned what had been written on that missing page, the disagreement was no longer about a coronation schedule. It had become a confrontation over trust. William did not raise his voice when he entered the king's private sitting room. That made the moment more dangerous. Camilla was already there. Charles stood beside the fireplace, and the missing page from Windsor rested on a small table between them. The prince closed the door himself. No aides, no secretaries, no witnesses. Then he looked directly at his stepmother and asked the question that had been burning through the palace. "Did you ask him to delay me?" William picked up the disputed page and read the proposed clause aloud. It allowed the existing royal household to recommend a 12-month delay to coronation plans after accession, the moment a new sovereign formally inherited the crown, if continuity and stability were judged to be at risk. That mattered because the future king could be mourning his father while other households debated when he should be publicly crowned. Camilla admitted she had discussed the clause with Charles. The Queen Consort insisted she had wanted to protect the monarchy from a rushed transition, not stop the prince from taking control. William pushed the paper toward her. He asked why his judgment had been excluded from a proposal concerning his own coronation. Camilla pushed it back. "Because grief changes judgment." The words landed hard. The prince told her he had spent his entire adult life being trained for the exact moment everyone now seemed to expect him to mishandle. Charles stepped between them. The king told his son to sit. William remained standing. Camilla watched him refuse, and she understood that the argument had moved beyond procedure. Camilla finally explained, through the recorded private conversation later preserved in the transition file, that she had not written the original clause. Members of a continuity group had brought it to her. The group was a temporary circle of royal advisors, seeking to preserve palace stability during a change of monarch. They believed Charles's death could leave a brief centre of influence empty. She had listened because she feared disorder. William heard something else. He heard people planning authority around his grief. Charles broke his silence. The king admitted that discovering the proposal had convinced him the transition itself was becoming a prize for competing ambitions. His lifetime coronation decree was designed to destroy that vacuum before it could exist. William immediately demanded every name connected to the group. The monarch refused. The prince's face hardened. Charles did not refuse to protect them. He had already stripped their authority away. The confrontation had exposed the fear behind the decree. But the real shock was still hidden in the machinery of the palace, where Charles had quietly begun dismantling an entire chain of control. The public imagined coronations were shaped by robes, ancient music, and centuries of tradition. Charles knew better. Behind every ceremony stood lists, signatures, access, schedules, and people who could delay a decision with a single carefully worded objection. So the king did something few around him expected. He stopped arguing about loyalty and began changing authority. One office at a time, he placed William's future coronation directly beneath the sovereign's hand. Charles created the Temporary Coronation Transition Council and placed himself beside William at its head. The council was a small decision-making body, formed to control the planning of the future ceremony and the transfer of royal authority. No recommendation could move forward without both men's written approval. That mattered because the continuity group had previously been able to suggest delays, alter ceremonial roles, and appoint transition representatives after the monarch's death. The decree removed those powers completely. William would no longer inherit a system where others could shape his first days while he was grieving. Anne received the revised authority list in her private office. The Princess Royal reached Camilla's name, paused, and closed the folder. The Queen Consort had been reduced to a ceremonial consultative role, meaning she could offer advice but could no longer make binding decisions about the coronation. Anne understood the political logic, but she also understood the human cost. Later, she faced Charles and told him that protecting William was necessary. Humiliating his wife, she warned, would create a different wound. The king remained cold. He said he was removing ambiguity, not punishing Camilla. William discovered another clause before the argument could settle. Charles had reserved one extraordinary power for himself. The monarch alone would choose the date on which the coronation decree became irreversible, meaning the transition could no longer be delayed or rewritten by another household. The prince read the sentence twice. Then he found a handwritten note beside it. His father had already chosen the date. Charles had sealed that date until William personally confirmed he was emotionally prepared to accept the crown in his father's presence. The future king felt the pressure immediately. This was no longer only about authority. His father was asking him to become ready for the throne while the king was still standing beside him. William moved to confront Charles, but the moment never came. Camilla had received her own revised briefing. The Queen Consort opened it alone and saw, line by line, exactly how little authority she would retain once the coronation mechanism began. Charles had designed the decree to eliminate a future battle, but when Camilla read her new position in black ink, the first casualty of that decision became painfully human. There was no dramatic outburst, no shattered glass, no furious demand for a meeting. Camilla simply sat in her room with the revised briefing open across her knees and read the same paragraph 3 times when an aide quietly asked whether she needed anything. The Queen Consort shook her head. Then the door closed, and the woman who had survived decades of public hostility finally faced a different kind of pain. Exclusion from the future being designed inside her own home. Camilla studied every line of the briefing because the words carried a reality she could no longer avoid. Her new role allowed her to attend ceremonial consultations, but prevented her household from changing William's coronation timetable, recommending appointments, or joining the formal transfer of authority. The coronation mechanism, meaning the official process that prepares and controls the ceremony where a new monarch is crowned, would now move forward under William and Charles alone. The king believed these limits were necessary because the next reign could not begin with competing centres of influence. Yet the Queen Consort felt the emotional weight behind every restriction. Camilla folded the briefing carefully and walked to Charles's study. She placed the document beside his pen and stood silently before him. "Was I ever part of the future, or only yours?" she asked. The king struggled to answer because he understood the pain behind the question. He told her she was part of his life, his journey, and his family, but William's reign had to belong completely to William. The distinction hurt. She turned away before her emotions could overcome her. Camilla later explained her decision through a recorded private conversation preserved with the transition documents. She admitted she had supported the delay clause because she feared the prince would remove her from royal life within days of becoming monarch. Her fear was not about power alone, it was about disappearing after spending years fighting for acceptance. The Queen Consort never expected that her concern would convince Charles that the succession needed stronger boundaries. Charles revealed, through a documented account attached to the decree review, that he had never planned to erase her from royal life. The king had prepared personal protections guaranteeing her residence, dignity, and public position after his reign. But he had separated those protections from government decisions and coronation authority. He wanted security for his wife, not control over his son's future. Camilla left the study carrying a different understanding of the decree. The conflict had changed. Then she saw William waiting in the corridor. The prince did not walk away. He asked for 10 minutes alone, with no Charles and no advisors between them. For the first time since the decree was signed, the future king and the queen consort were about to speak not as rival households, but as two people terrified of what the next reign might take from them. They had spent years speaking through titles, schedules, formal dinners, and carefully controlled family occasions. But this time, William closed the door and left every institution outside. No private secretaries, no king, no prepared language. Camilla sat opposite him with her hands still clasped around the briefing Charles had rewritten. The prince did not accuse her. He asked one simple question. Were you trying to stop me, or were you afraid of being left behind? William waited for the answer because this conversation was no longer about a document. The continuity clause, a written condition designed to control what happens during a royal transition, had threatened his authority because it allowed others to influence the timing of his coronation. Camilla accepted that supporting the clause without speaking directly to him had damaged trust. She knew the decree could not simply disappear because Charles had placed his own authority and reputation behind the lifetime coronation plan. Camilla finally lowered the briefing and admitted what she had hidden. The Queen Consort explained that she had spent years fighting to be accepted beside Charles, and the thought of losing her place the moment he was gone had frightened her. She was not trying to control William's future. She said she was afraid of becoming irrelevant after dedicating so much of her life to the crown. The prince listened without interrupting, but his expression remained guarded. William then revealed his own fear through the recorded conversation later attached to the private family account. The future king admitted that being crowned while his father watched created a different kind of pressure. The decree felt like an extraordinary gift because Charles was protecting his beginning. But it also felt like a rehearsal for grief. He would have to become king emotionally before he had lost his father. Camilla surprised him with her next words. She would formally withdraw every objection to the decree. The Queen Consort did not ask for restored influence, special authority, or a larger role. She asked only that William never see Charles's final years as preparation for his own reign alone. The king was still a father, not just a predecessor waiting to be replaced. William answered carefully. He promised that her future place would be discussed with dignity, but fear would never control his coronation. The prince did not offer a dramatic gesture. He simply opened the door for her. She paused, thanked him for speaking honestly, and walked away, knowing the conflict had changed. William went directly to Charles's private room. The prince told his father he was ready to see the sealed coronation date. The king looked at his son and realised the moment he had been waiting for had finally,